The president's decision to veto aid Ukrainians has sparked a heated public debate. What are its consequences for everyday life? We'll discuss this today. Our guest is London professor and sociologist, Dr. Karol Nawrocki. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you.
Analyzing Nawrocki's decision, can we talk about such fatigue with refugees here? Or is there rather such an effect of political rhetoric and economic challenges in your opinion?
I think that, of course, the processes related to the growing diversity in Polish society are reflected in the social mood. And here we are talking about structural conditions, about the fact that the influx, whether of forced refugees or of the workforce, is associated with a certain intensity of certain existing difficulties or social pressures related to access to the labor market, access to social experiences, etc. Nevertheless, we see very clearly that this process that is now taking place before us is caused by the supply of ideology through political actors. And here we are talking about both the government side and the presidential side. So, on the one hand, as you said, to some extent we have some kind of objective conditions that cause this diversity, which Poland has not had to deal with before, to cause certain tensions in certain sectors of society or economy. However, what we see is mainly the result of the actions of political actors.
So we can say here that President Nawrocki's veto can be treated here primarily as a populist step? And which one is aimed at such a strengthening of the position among the conservative electorate?
Absolutely, this is a kind of populism, a kind of populist Euroscepticism. It is also something that he deals with scientifically. Populism in its purest form is about such dichotomization, about showing that there are us and them. And it is in such a classic domestic discourse that there is usually a corrupt elite versus real people, and on the international level there can also be other countries here, or, for example, migrants. President Trump did the same when it came to the Mexicans back in 2016. Prime Minister David Cameron did the same in the United Kingdom towards Poles a decade ago. Before Brexit, they wanted to take child benefits in the UK away from Polish migrants, and a decade later this is happening in Poland against Ukrainian migrants and forced migrants. So yes, it's definitely a populist movement, and not only in the context of a certain kind of electorate that already exists, but I think in the direction of building the president's own electorate, which is not necessarily conservative, but simply right-wing and reluctant to the diversity that we see here.
And to what extent does this decision then show such a real social mood? And to what extent is it the result of a political struggle?
As I said before, we always have some kind of processes here, which take place, one could say, a little more objectively related to access to education, access to healthcare, access to the labor market. And this certainly causes some kind of tension in the adjustment process. But these changes in sentiment towards Ukrainians in Poland in particular, i.e. this decline from the favor of about 3.4% of the society in 2022 to 50% 2 years ago, now to 30%, is largely caused by rhetoric. Nevertheless, it should also be noted here that the aversion towards Ukrainians in Poland is similar to the aversion towards Germans in Poland. So you can see some kind of convergence here, when it comes to the fact that part of the electorate is simply reluctant to strangers. And here again, I would say that here the agency of political actors and the fact that these narratives are created and spread by the media, whether mainstream or online media, causes this type of sentiment to be born. Such sentiments, verbalized in this way, are rarely based on what is really happening socially, in order to isolate and discriminate against a specific group in this way, and saying that they are the cause of all evil. Here we have the agency of political actors, as I said.
So we can now expect an increase in social tensions between Poles and Ukrainians in connection with this decision?
It is very difficult to say to what extent we have already reached the climax of this campaign and to what extent it will also start to flatten out. I think the same thing happened in the United Kingdom. Brexit was the moment when the majority of the British population voted against Europe. It also voted because so many Poles and Central and Eastern Europeans did not want it in the British Isles. And very soon afterwards this topic ceased to be so strongly exposed in the media. It ceased to be part of the political discourse, and today Poland and Poles are seen as an important partner of the United Kingdom, as a country with a high standard of living, where public policy is at a high level, and Polish migrants are today shown as an example of those who adapted very well and are statistically richer than the British people. So let's hope that this process will also take place in Poland, that we are now going through a very difficult moment related also to the geopolitical situation, to the war situation of Ukraine, which must never be forgotten, and to the fact that we do not know what the future will be. I think that here this coupling between objective facts related to which way the war will go, when the fighting will be abandoned, because the war can last for a very long time, and the fighting can stop, this can also affect this process. I think that we cannot afford to think that this is a kind of slippery slope and that it will only get worse from now on. It also depends, I think, on the actors of everyday life, not only political life. Of course, we see this conflict at the highest levels of government. I think that as a consequence, the government will not particularly care about this intensifying even more, and the legacy of 2022 is that Poles have mostly helped it to blow something out of Ukraine, and these relations are cultivated at the economic, social, cultural level. Ukrainian is today the second most frequently used language in the Republic of Poland, and this social reality is also a kind of flywheel for further social relations, so we cannot think that only here these politicians will dictate how we should think. So, of course, these types of messages have a kind of agency, but in the long run, they do not necessarily have to be what determines Polish-Ukrainian relations in Poland.
Is there now a risk that similar restrictions have consolidated the image of Ukrainians as competitors from a social person, and what consequences would this have for the integration of Ukrainians in Poland in general?
In the Polish context, where more than 75% of industrial refugees from Ukraine work, where most migrants from Ukraine work and contribute almost 18 billion Polish zlotys a year to the Polish budget in terms of all contributions and taxes, and take out about 4 billion Polish zlotys from it. This is quite a bizarre argument. Of course, it appears, and it does not appear only in Poland. A migrant is both the one who comes to take a job and the one who comes to prey on social policy and receives social benefits. He is the so-called Schrödinger's migrant, so he is both there and he is not. He is both lazy and takes jobs. As I say, these discourses, these negative messages related to migration are not a Polish invention. Fortunately, unfortunately, they appear, they intensify in political turning moments, but in the long term they also flatten out, because it is very difficult to believe in them indefinitely. Especially since Poles are an entrepreneurial society, a society where there is a high value of work, and they see that Ukrainian migrants, but also other migrants in Poland, work hard, and that without them the Polish economy would not grow as fast as it has grown in recent years.
How do such decisions affect the image of Poland in the EU, which generally perceived Poland as one of the main defenders of Ukraine?
Unfortunately, at the moment, similar processes related to the reduction of benefits for Ukrainian forced migrants have also taken place in Germany. And it is a campaign that is also inspired by various non-European sources. So especially extreme right-wing and nationalist political movements in Europe are taking up this topic not only in Poland. Unfortunately, Poland here is not an infamous case of this type of process. Again, I think that two issues should be separated here. On the one hand, the memory of Poland as a humanitarian empire in inverted commas, which has been preserved in the way it was 3 years ago, will remain and cannot be erased. What we have seen over the past weeks, however, is the unprecedented solidarity of European leaders with President Zelensky, with Ukraine vis-a-vis what is happening, the White House and Washington. Europe will already spend more on defense and maintaining Ukrainian statehood than the United States. I think that there is a lot of understanding in Europe because this type of political movements like the one of President Nawrocki are part of an internal political game. Of course, this is no excuse, but I do not think that at this stage it will affect how the image of Poland is perceived in the European Union. It is different in Ukraine, where this type of message is very poorly received and for obvious reasons, because Ukraine is defending itself and Europe against the Russian invader.
How would you characterize the level of political polarization in Poland in general as of August this year?
I think this is a very general question. It is difficult to say whether we are more polarized than we were a few months ago during the presidential campaign. It certainly hasn't diminished. Those who wanted these presidential elections, which ended in one way or another, to cause some kind of agreement across divisions on issues such as political or security issues related to Polish security, these hopes were in vain, and we can see that at least at the political level it did not take place. When it comes to the polarization of society itself, there are more nuances here, and sociology gives us some answers on this topic. On the one hand, people are in favor of one or the other political camp. There are a few topics that incite them very strongly, that fascinate them at specific moments, but when it comes to everyday life, it does not necessarily have to translate into interpersonal conflicts. Of course, now we hear about some kind of incidents related to aversion to foreigners, aversion to Ukrainians or other foreigners in Poland, but again, of course, these processes are undesirable, they should be criticized, but it is not the case that only in Poland they take place in such difficult moments of political competition and what is happening geopolitically. So let's hope that we are now at such a difficult climax and that this type of political intensification, and thus also this polarization, which the editor mentioned, cannot continue at the same high level all the time. But again, it all depends on which way the hostilities will go, and I think that some solution to the situation in Ukraine, some kind of ceasefire, would certainly change this kind of fatigue with this situation. Of course, it is the Ukrainians who are supposed to be tired of the war, not the Europeans, but the perception of this even among European societies is the way it is.
And if we talk about the general concept of political polarization, which social groups feel the most negative effects of this polarization?
Of course, we are talking about people of the so-called working class, people working below their qualifications, who came from Ukraine, for example, people generally working in the informal economy, illegally, with an irregular employment relationship, because this also happens very often. And here, of course, also taking into account what this migration cohort looks like after the 22nd year, i.e. that they were mainly women, mainly young people, then those people who had less money at the very beginning, had less social capital, had lower education, will do worse in the long term. And this is the whole drama of this situation. Also migrants, whether pre-war or forced migrants from Ukraine, who brought capital with them, brought with them knowledge of English or Polish, brought with them a career or business, they will cope. But those who are no longer doing well and who encountered further difficulties here will be the ones who will be most affected by this situation. And again, the same thing happened to Poles in Great Britain around Brexit. It was those who were no longer coping with the labour market and in adapting to British society who felt it the most. This, of course, is the inglorious legacy of the political rhetoric we are dealing with now.
In general, do you think it is possible to recreate a high level of social solidarity, similar to what it was in 2022? And in general, if possible, under what conditions?
I think that the year 2022 and this moment was, of course, such an intensification, such a mass mobilization, a mobilization related to an incredible threat and a sense of solidarity in Polish society and in other societies of the world, especially in Europe. And this is also scientifically documented. So it is difficult to talk about creating an intensification that was in a sense incidental. Nevertheless, what we have noticed after 2022 is that the response to this state of forced emergency of refugees from Ukraine took place not only at the state level or at the level of civil society as such, but also at the level of civic ecosystems, in which activists, people associated with culture, but also business and local authorities were active. And this legacy of joint action in the face of a crisis, in the face of a state of emergency, is something that remains in society. It is a kind of muscle memory. And it can be reborn in the next moment of crisis or in the next moment of the state of emergency. And here, already in 2022, the Ukrainian diaspora was an important part of this ecosystem in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And now we have even more people who took part in it, who are often people who received help, but when another crisis comes, and it inevitably will, they can know how to provide help. So I think it's hard to talk about recreating this moment, because it was amazing and one of a kind, but as I said, this memory of how to help and that grassroots help, complementary, organized in a sense ad hoc in the first hours, days or weeks of the crisis is something that already existed in Polish society or in Poland before this crisis of 2022 and will be reborn, hopefully. And this is the strength of civil society, that it reacts to crises faster than state structures. And we see the same in Ukraine. In Ukraine, civil society is the fourth or fifth power. The Maidan is in power, and we saw it a few months ago, when the administration of President Zelensky wanted to limit the rights of anti-corruption agencies. Here, too, civil society in Ukraine was the first social actor to respond to this and also contributed to the change of this legislation.
But in general, the beginning of the war will probably be an example in the history of relations between Poland and Ukraine, which will simply enter history already.
Let us hope that the future can be built on this positive legacy. As I said, we are now in a very difficult political moment because of what is happening internally in Poland, but also geopolitically more broadly. And this memory, these relationships between people that were established at that time, this help, this gratitude on both sides is something that remains. These are stronger relations than political rhetoric, which sometimes influences how people think, sometimes something they say, sometimes how they vote. But it is these relationships closer to the body, related to everyday life, to the immediate neighborhood, to work, to family relations, that are friendly. They are what really creates our worldview. And in some way this adaptation, as I said, not only of migrants to Polish, but also of Poles to the growing diversity. Let's hope that this will evolve in the coming years.
Indeed, this is the case. Thank you. Our guest was London professor and sociologist, Dr. Karol Nawrocki. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.